to the end of the story. Something would interest me. I picked this one here. This is called Good Girl Wants It Bad. This was from 8-10 years ago. And it was one of the most difficult stories I wrote because I had trouble finding the opening, as I sometimes do. And I had the premise of an idea, which was a young girl who thought highly, who no matter how horribly she behaved, she always saw herself as a good person. And I loved that idea. And I could not make that story work. It started, and it just never took off. It was dead. And I was always looking at the beginning of her life, how she became this person who did things that weren't very pleasant. And then eventually, again, starting, as I have done with many novels and stories, I found the idea in my head, which was I was going to have this woman awaiting execution. And it was the diary she was keeping as she awaited execution that she was going to use to convince a judge that she was a good person. Now, that idea just really interested me. And all the things she had done in her life suddenly became backstory to that. It wasn't even as interesting. The interest was that every day her trying to convince this judge, who she hoped would read her diary, that she was a good person. And the story began somewhere, and it took off. And I had no trouble writing that first draft. It was much too long, as most of my stuff is the first draft. And then I went back and tried to cut to bring out the narrative interest, which is what's going to happen to her next, and are they going to fry her? I know this seems like simple ideas, but you need something like that in your first draft, or else you're pushing a car uphill. Right? Other times I've written stories. This is a book of stories. This is my first book of stories. I'm trying to think of, here's the story I often use as an example, which is the story called Dazzle. And the way I started that story was I was walking in a park, and I saw a dog in the park. I was living in Chadwell Heath. And the dog was wandering wild. There was a bunch of dogs wandering through the park, and there was no one with them. And I looked at the dogs, and I thought, one idea, which is that dogs don't like people. Dogs like other dogs. That idea came to my head. And the idea was that, they pretend to be nice to us, but once they're with other dogs, they're really happy. And that was all I had. So I went home, and I started this story. I said Dazzle. And I started a story about a dog named Dazzle. And it just took off. I wrote one scene of this dog talking, and then what happened to the dog next, And I wrote the first draft in maybe 8 days. No, not a false start. Just started it and finished it. But I had a first scene, which was this dog talking about his life and how he had it perfect because people fed him and took care of him. Now, I had my first scene. And I followed on from that, and I finished it, and I cut a third of it when I was done. Sometimes scenes that just didn't work. Sometimes the scenes, when you're going forward, you just find some scenes just aren't important to the central narrative. You identify the central narrative from your first scene. And that story, like maybe half of my stories, the stories I like, was easy to write, the first draft. And then the revision is really cutting and pruning and tightening what you had before. If you start, I'll close off now because this has gone too long for the YouTube videos. I will close with one last thought. If you start a story and you don't find what the story is about until the second or third scene, you really are going to be in trouble. Okay, I've been there a bunch of times. Going back, if you find let's say you find the middle of your story. I've had this happen, where I've written the first scenes and they were crap, and then suddenly the scene took off, and I started going, and I wrote, I'll finish the story, and then I go back, I'll go back and fix the beginning. That's like going back and fixing your first marriage, or you're going back and overcoming the mistakes you did as a parent on your first child. You can't really just go back and revise these things because you're in the middle of the story. So it's very hard. Brian Mora, the writer who another writer I learned a lot from, always said, he said, the first chapter, the first scene of your book is always the most important. And you don't need to struggle after that. But once you have something that's working for you, and you won't understand that until you've actually been doing it over and over again, then you should be okay. But if you don't have that opening, you have to go look for something, or you have to go try again. And the opening is the most important part. I say this, I know, almost every lecture. But the first draft, you can be shaggy, you can overdo it, you can just do extra stuff. But it's easier to cut at the end of the book than it is to add scenes that you're missing. Okay? So finding that important central position of the book when things start to develop. In this book, in Simenon, to me, the book really makes it shift when his boss, Maigret's boss, keeps saying, well, don't bother my friends, don't bother my friends. And at one, finally, he says, okay, maybe you're onto something. That's a big shift in the book. You couldn't find that as a writer unless you've done the whole first 2/3 of the book. So I always recommend Simenon, just because he'll keep your eyes on the prize, he'll keep your mind focused on the main parts of the book. They aren't, as complex as as a Faulkner novel or Virginia Woolf or the latest Booker Prize winner. But they certainly are doing all the stuff that the good books do, however complex. Okay, this is much too long and a bit rambling.